We've all been sold a lie that happiness is just one book, one therapist, one guru away. And last year alone, we spent $11 billion trying to fix ourselves. But here's the problem. Despite all of these promises, depression and anxiety are at an all-time high. And worse, the more that we chase happiness, the more depressed that we become. So what if everything that you've been told about happiness isn't just wrong, but it's making us more miserable? And this isn't just my opinion. I mean, take a look at this. What you're looking at is a 2011 survey from Ipsos, which showed that about 77% of people worldwide back then said that they were happy. But when you fast forward to today, that number has dropped into the 60s depending on the country. But what's really scary is how disturbingly low it's gotten in the US. In 2021, only 19% of Americans describe themselves as very happy. Just let that sink in. That's the lowest ever recorded in history. But here's where it gets even crazier. While happiness is plummeting, we're actually spending more money than ever trying to fix it. The self-help industry alone is worth between $11 and $14 billion a year in the US. And by almost every measure, real happiness is dropping, and depression and anxiety keep climbing higher than ever. So if the self-help industry were working, then why do we keep getting worse? Now, I'm not saying that all self-help is bad or that therapy isn't valuable, because obviously therapy can be life-changing. But the broader happiness industry, the flashy marketing, the self-proclaimed gurus telling you that just one more book, one more course, one more mindset shift is the key to true happiness, well, that's where we're being sold a false promise. You see, happiness by definition is tied to circumstances. A good day at work, a new relationship, a raise, hitting a big milestone, all of that feels great, and when things get better, so does your mood. But if we believe that changing our circumstances will finally bring lasting happiness, we eventually learn that it never works that way. Even for those that got everything they ever wanted, they usually echo Jim Carrey when he said,
"And I wish people could realize all their dreams and wealth and fame, and so that they could see that it's not where you're going to find your sense of completion."
Or take Michael Phelps, the most decorated Olympian in history. After achieving everything he ever dreamed of, he sank into deep depression, asking himself,
"Cool, now what?
Why am I still unfulfilled?" And we see the same story with social media influencers and their seemingly near-perfect lives online. Behind the scenes, anxiety and depression are rampant, and surveys show 80% of influencers report suffering from burnout. All of this goes to show that if your ultimate goal is just to feel happy, then no amount of money, success, or followers will ever be enough. But here's the real twist. No one could have imagined that this relentless pursuit of happiness is the very thing causing us to be even more enslaved in this cycle of misery. Our whole lives we've been told, do whatever makes you happy. It sounds harmless, positive even, but think about what that really means. If the standard for a good life is that I need to feel good most of the time, then what happens during prolonged periods where I feel sad, stressed, or disappointed? I'll assume that something's wrong with me, with my circumstances, or that I just need to buy the next product that promises to fix it. But at any rate, there's still this one big problem that psychologists have found in recent years. More and more research has proven that the harder that you chase happiness, the less happy that you'll actually become. It's like trying to grip water. The harder you squeeze, the faster that it slips through your fingers. In fact, a UC Berkeley study published in the journal Emotion found that individuals who place a high value on feeling happy were more prone to loneliness and depressive symptoms, ironically undermining the very goal that they were pursuing. So in other words, the more that we chase happiness, the further away it gets. It's almost as if we never stop to think, maybe the real issue isn't that we're failing to reach happiness, maybe happiness was never meant to be the goal in the first place. And even these high-profile stories barely scratch the surface. Beneath this endless pursuit of feel-good moments is this much more frightening truth that even knowing this, people still fall into the trap. Why? Because the way that we think about happiness is completely upside down. We have to start looking at the things that actually do work, and they actually might shock you. There's a reason why so many people have turned to the Bible when things go wrong, because studies show that people who truly live by biblical principles report having happier and more fulfilling lives. Pew Research even found that people who actively practice their faith, attending church regularly and actually living it out, report higher levels of satisfaction compared to their non-religious peers. And it's not just about going to church. When the Bible encourages marriage as opposed to casual hookups, the data shows that those who are married have higher levels of happiness, and the most fulfilling sex lives Well, those belong to those who waited until marriage. And other major biblical themes, such as radical forgiveness, loving others as you love yourself, and helping others, have also been proven to boost your mental health and give you a more fulfilled life. But don't let this fool you. Having a biblical worldview doesn't mean that life is easy or pain-free, but it does mean that you could have something remarkable, something that the earliest Christians had. During the brutal Roman persecution, Christians faced torture and execution, and yet historical records say that some of them were actually smiling as they went to their death. And just to put into context just how brutal these executions were, we're talking about being beheaded, burned at the stake and used as human torches, and even things like being tied to 2 horses and having them run in opposite directions so that way they could be ripped apart. But despite the absolute horror of these executions, these early Christians never lost their peace. One powerful example of this is the story of Blandia, a young Christian slave girl who, in 177 AD, was tortured and thrown to be devoured by wild beasts in an arena. And despite brutal torment, witnesses said that she was so calm and resolute in her faith that her persecutors were baffled. They couldn't break her spirit. And some of the other Christian martyrs were said to even crack jokes and laugh as they were being executed. And this isn't just ancient history, because you see the same thing happening today. Richard Wurmbrand, a Romanian pastor who spent 14 years in prison under communist rule, described how he actually danced for joy in his cell despite being tortured, starved, and isolated. He said that no amount of suffering could take his peace away. So we're not talking about just a feel-good happiness based on good circumstances, because, let's be honest, their circumstances were horrific. So what was it that was so real to them that it gave them this unshakable calm in these literal worst-case scenarios? Well, it wasn't blind optimism. They believed in what the Bible calls joy. Unlike happiness, which rises and falls with circumstances, biblical joy is consistent and defiant in the face of suffering. According to the New Testament, this joy, empowered by the Holy Spirit, gave the Apostle Paul the strength to sing in prison after being beaten. It's the same joy that enabled early Christian martyrs to face death with peace, knowing that their suffering had eternal significance. And central to their convictions was the idea that Jesus didn't simply die, he rose again. God took the darkest event in human history and he turned it into the greatest good, redemption, and an eternal future with him. So they believed that if God could transform that depth of suffering into ultimate victory, then no pain that they would experience would be meaningless. Another key belief was that through Christ's sacrifice, they weren't merely forgiven, they were fully accepted as children of God, not because of personal performance, but because Christ lived the perfect life in their place. And this conviction changed everything. It released them from the exhausting cycles of chasing happiness, and it gave them a sense of assurance when life fell apart. The same power they believed had raised Jesus from the dead gave them a confidence and a joy that couldn't be taken away in hard times. They trusted that one day they too would be raised just as Christ was to a reality free from suffering. And that's why these martyrs and persecuted believers throughout history could face death with joy. Not because their pain wasn't real, but because their hope was even greater. So, does this mean that Christians are always walking around with a big smile, acting like everything is perfect? Of course not. We go through real struggles, real heartbreak, and real moments of deep sadness. But there's an unshakable joy underneath it all. And this isn't just some abstract churchy idea, you actually see it play out in everyday life. Studies consistently show that people who practice selflessness, believe in God, and stay connected to a strong church community tend to have better mental and physical health. And this lines up perfectly with what the Bible has been saying all along. Love your neighbor, invest in relationships, and don't make life all about you and your happiness. You know, it's almost as if we were designed to function according to these principles. Augustine once said, "Our hearts are restless until they find rest in you," reminding us that finite pleasures can't fully satisfy the longings within us. And in Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis said, "If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world." So the point is simple. Ultimately, we find lasting fulfillment only when we draw from the source of all joy, God Himself. And that's why no job, relationship, or worldly achievement could permanently fill the void in our hearts. But when we realize that we were created for a greater reality, then joy becomes something that we receive, not something that we endlessly chase. At the end of the day, happiness isn't a bad thing. But if it's your main pursuit, it will leave you disappointed every time. So if you're watching this and you're burned out from chasing happiness that seems to keep slipping away, then maybe the answer isn't to chase it harder. Maybe the answer is to look for a joy that can't be taken away, a joy anchored in a God whose love remains steady even when life doesn't. Biblical joy has room for both laughter and tears, triumph and tragedy, because real joy isn't found in what changes, it's found in the one who never changes.